It should surprise 0% of people to hear that I am still struggling with this, hence the extremely long time since I posted a video. Life happened, some good, some bad, but I'm finally getting back into the swing of things and wanted to share where I'm sitting now and what my next step is. So basically, the struggle I was still having with this pattern was how much I was going to have to size it up. So I'd said in a previous video that what you were trying to achieve with the clothing from this era was a certain silhouette. They didn't have tiny waists, but they padded out the bust and the hips as needed to achieve a certain shape. It was called a pigeon bust or a pigeon silhouette. And I will try to, if I can figure out the technology, to insert some pictures somewhere to show you exactly what that means. You don't get a really good idea of what that looks like here, but if you've seen any pictures from the early 1900s, it's a really specific look with a really rounded, pronounced bust and very pronounced hips and what looks like a small waist, but it was just the person's normal waist. So I was trying to basically reverse engineer the measurements of this pattern and how much I would need to size it up. So I measured the waistband because they didn't give you any waist measurements on this one. I'm not sure why. The waist measurement of this pattern, the waistband, is 29 inches. Comparing this to my actual measurements, if you can read my pencil. So my waist is about 33 inches and I have a fairly standard hourglass shape. So my bust is 40 inch and my hips are 40 inch. You can see, so for instance, this pattern, 38 bust. So the 38 bust, they want your hip measurement to be 43.5 inches. So even if I was literally just taking my current measurements, I would have to use some kind of hip pad. So I have to make a hip pad. Kind of doing the math, and there's 2 inches in between all of these, I would have to go up to a 42-inch bust. That is, again, bigger than my natural bust size. So hypothetically, I would have to use some kind of bust improver or a bust padding and somehow get my hips almost 8.5 inches larger. That's fairly easy with a hip pad, so I'm not so much worried about that. I'm not sure what I'm going to do for the bust improver. I'll figure that out later. But then I started to think that they would have this dress on over a corset. And if you have a regular sort of slightly squishy body, corsets act differently on people. And we're not talking tight lacing, just physically getting into a corset, it slims your shape out just a little bit. And I know from previous wearing of bodices, like Ren Fair bodices, I could easily go down an inch or two in my waist in a corset, which means I wouldn't have to pad up to 42 inches. If in a corset my waist went down to 31 inches, then I could follow these measurements. So I have to make a corset. So I ordered one. I didn't order a corset, I ordered a pattern. So doing some research, I ended up ordering this one. On most of the websites, it's called a door corset. And this was the one I kept on coming across as a recommendation for a beginner. This is not the right year for this. I am aware of that. I wanted something that I could possibly wear with other outfits from an earlier era. I really like late Victorian fashion as well. So I'm not just stuck into that mid to late Edwardian. And I think I can make this work. I'm not planning on making a different corset for every single outfit because that's not practical. And I've never met a corset before. So in researching, this one was recommended as one that would be good for a beginner. So I ordered a kit, which very nicely came with pattern, instructions, a bust, spiral boning here. So that's what I'm gonna do next. The hip pad's relatively easy. I've thought about ordering a pattern for that, but I don't think it's gonna be necessary, to be honest. I also need to make a chemise. So I do need to order a pattern for that. This chemise I have come across as a pattern or something very, very similar to it. You never wear a corset against your skin. It's always worn on top of something. So I do need a chemise, then it would be the corset, then you put the hip pattern over that. Hypothetically, you would then also have some sort of petticoat. Once you start looking at how much the hips are supposed to be padded out, it's not that hard to add several inches. It just seems like another 8.5 inches seemed a little impractical, but ultimately I need to just make these things to see what it really does. I've been watching Kathy Hayes videos a lot, and she's in the middle of working on an early 1900s dress and making mock-ups of her undergarments. And I've been learning a lot from that and looking at what the ideal measurements were supposed to be for that pigeon silhouette, for the Edwardian style. So I'm gonna make a corset. I'm not looking forward to this. I have also been watching a lot of videos on the corset making, and some of the videos make it look not hard. It's just a matter of getting the fit correct. Like I've said, I think I mentioned again in a previous video, some of my struggle is that for my size, my waist is relatively small. So I may have to go for the size where the hip is a little bit, this hip right here for me is too big. So I would probably have to use this size, but I will more than likely have to adjust the pattern, or the hips are going to be too big, or I would literally have to pad out the hip underneath the corset, which I don't really want to do. So I'm going to have to make a mock-up. I have to trace out the pattern so I don't have to cut this out, so I still have the different sizes available. If you are not a seamstress, don't know what a pattern looks like, I don't even want to fold this out right now, but these are the lines for all the different sizes. And if I ever lose weight and need to make a smaller corset, so I want to have all of this still available on the page. So I'm going to trace out the size that I actually need and cut it out of some tracing paper that I can then use to cut out the muslin to make a mock-up. So that's where we're sitting right now. I will not film me tracing out a pattern, but once I've got a mock-up put together, I will give that a look with everybody and see how it's looking and how much I'm going to have to adjust it and how much of a nightmare this is going to be. The mock-up is done. I did this a couple of nights ago and I haven't really looked at it since. The mock-up came together actually really quickly. I didn't even look at the instructions on the pattern because I can sometimes get into instruction overload. If I'm not understanding it 100%, I don't even want to mess with it. So I just stitched the pieces together. I put the busk in here using just another piece of cloth as a facing, which I'd seen some people on YouTube. I was watching Isabel from Prior Attire do a single layer corset, and maybe a couple other people. But I just did this facing so they could insert the busk, which worked really nicely. It doesn't look bad, and it actually fit nicely. I know for something like this, I should have actually stitched the boning channels in here and actually put the bones in and see how it fit. The reason I didn't want to do that is because this fabric is not going to sit the same as the fabric that I'm actually going to use. What that is going to be, this really thick cotton coutil. This is a lot thicker than this. So even just this is going to have more structure when you sew it together than this kind of muslin canvasy material. So what will happen is I will cut the busk out of this and I'll start cutting the pattern pieces from this. So the other issue I'm having is when I purchased the corset kit, it said it was for a single layer corset. That's why they sent it with this bit of ribbon that could be essentially stitched down to be used as boning channels. The pattern says it is for
a double layer corset, and that you should put the cotton coutil on the outside, and then you could do the inner layer should be another lighter cotton, sateen, something like that. And then what you do is you actually do just sew some channels into the fabric, and then you insert these guys, the boning. You insert the boning inside those channels. But that's the reason they send you this and say it's a single layer corset. So I've got a little bit of problem with the pattern. I've got enough background information from my research and watching other people make these single layer corsets. Like I mentioned, Isabel from Prior Attire, she made a really beautiful lap seam single layer corset, which I'd like to try in the future. I don't really want this to be a double layer corset. I'd like this to be something that I can wear. And I live in Texas where it's been 100 degrees plus every day. So I'd like this to be something that I could reasonably wear, and I don't want it to be 2 layers of cotton. I think this cotton coutil is thick enough that I could get away with just making this a single layer and using this ribbon for the boning channels. And I don't want to mess with the mock-up anymore because, again, like I said, this material is going to act differently than this canvas. So I think I'm willing to sacrifice this piece of fabric. I know the fit's going to be decently well enough, and just see how it goes. I can always take it apart and put it back together. You know, it's not the end of the world if the first attempt doesn't work out 100%. So that's what I'm going to do next. I'm actually really pleased with how easily the mock-up came together. You know, just sew the pieces together. You could pin them together, but it was a lot easier to just sort of maneuver the fabric as you were sewing it down, because that's, the fabric alone gives the corset a little bit of shape. It's not just the boning. I'm pleasantly pleased so far, and we'll see how the next few steps go.
I think it's been about a week since I filmed last, but I have been working on the corset. It's actually almost done. So I wanted to show where I was sitting right now, what I still needed to do. I am not going to say this was easy by any means, but it came together a lot easier than I was expecting, especially with how much I had been struggling with the dress. But there were so many resources that I was able to look at with other people making corsets from that period. I had no frame of reference for this dress. I've got really limited experience and information that was able to be found about it. And the pattern was, the pattern's pretty detailed, but I think if I hadn't had so many video resources that I was able to utilize, I think I would have been a lot more lost. I apologize if you can hear that noise in the background. The neighbors are doing construction on their house. So it's actually been really good. I am pleased with how it looks. I tried it on after I had all of the pieces sewn together, but not with the boning actually in it. So it fit nicely. I was happy enough with it. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. But for a first attempt, I think it's been really, really good. So let me show you. So it's 2 halves. So this is the right side, the right front, and then the left front. Basically what I am doing right now is I am putting the binding on the bottom. I've got both of the bottom bindings about, I've got one done. So you've got the nice binding there. The grommets were a nightmare. These are not even at all. Fortunately, it's the back. I figured out my mistake, what I was doing wrong, about halfway. So the second half looks a little bit better. The first tool I bought was wrong, so I ended up having to buy more grommets and a different tool. Eventually, I got it to work, and it was fine. It's not even. This next one will be better. That's what I keep on telling myself. This was a learning experience. The next one will be better. I did do the lapped seams that I was talking about, and you can see it on the inside. So this double line of stitching on the back here. I could have sewed these channels on the inside, which I did first, but I kind of liked how it looked on the outside. Purely an aesthetic choice, again, of something that nobody's gonna see but me and my missus. But I liked how it looked. Ultimately, since I did the channels on the outside, I could have just sewed this from the inside out and enclosed the raw seams underneath the boning strips. So I did extra work that I didn't need to, but it was practice. It looks nice. It's really nicely finished from the inside. This is the nicest finished on the inside. Seams all done, closed, everything. I even did some overcasting on an inside piece here so it wouldn't unravel. I didn't do an amazing job, but again, trying out those little techniques that'll be good for the future to have done and have some experience with. This was definitely an increase on the skill set. Again, it is not perfect. There are wonky bits, but the next ones will look better. I am going to finish up the binding. On the top binding, the pattern suggested to put a strip of ribbon on the inside of this channel. So when it's closed, you can kind of use it to sort of cinch the top a little bit more shut, because there is a little bit of a gap from the top rivet and hook enclosure. I do not have any ribbon, and I don't feel like going to the store just to get ribbon. So I'm gonna use just a little bit of yarn. I think that'll work, and I do think I'll need it based on how it fit when I tried it on for the first time. The busk was harder to close than I expected. I don't know if that's me. I don't know if maybe I had it laced a little bit too tight when I first put it on. This is not super flexible, obviously, because it's not meant to be. So that was kind of weird. I don't know if I put it in wrong and that was what the problem was. Not a big deal. It's just, it was maybe a little bit harder just to get latched in the front than I expected. So I'm going to finish doing this binding up top. This binding is closed by hand on the inside. So machine stitched the first layer. Might be easier if I show you this one up close. I've been kind of testing out some different stitching styles. Basically, the idea is that, and you can see I made a couple of mistakes in a couple of bits. Again, not a big deal. The idea is that the inside stitching should not be visible on the outside. So that is down and good, but you can't see the stitching there. So what you do for this binding, and you can do this for any kind of bias binding, any kind of hemming, it's stitched on the inside, fold it down. And you can do this a couple of ways. You're basically doing a whip stitch. So going under, let me get my thimble so I don't hurt myself. And then going under again, trying to catch the fabric and not the binding on the other side. And just kind of catching that top edge. And ultimately, any little threads you have, trying to enclose those on the inside of this binding, because you're using this binding to finish the raw edge. And if you've stabbed yourself on the other side, that means you went too far through. So this is the tedious side. I'm not using completely modern techniques, and you can tell I don't use my thimble that often because it feels very awkward. But it would be extremely difficult with all the bones and the different channels and the multiple layers to try to get this last bit done by machine. So just hand sewing this last bit is technically easier, even though it is time consuming. And when we get to this end, what we're gonna do, I'm gonna need to cut off some of this. Fold this in and then fold this down. And then that will make that nice little enclosed corner right there. I could be pinning this all down. I really didn't do that a lot for this. I pressed a lot of things so they were flat. If you're not familiar with bias, I bought bias tape. I did not make my own bias binding because I'm lazy. That's already nicely pressed flat, so it already gives you a nice edge to do what you need to with the bias tape. Just press everything. Once it stays flat, you can, for the most part, just hold it down. And trying to get pins through the multiple layers of fabric not be the easiest. After this, after I've got all the binding tape done, really the last step is to do what's called flossing. And I can show you some examples of that I found, but basically it's a decorative stitch that you'll do on the outside of these boning channels in the top and bottom. And A, it looks pretty. B, it actually will help to keep them in place. So it does look pretty, but it does actually serve a function as well. I'm going to do a little bit more of a whip stitch over this end because I just want to make sure it stays closed. Maybe not the best technique, but through here to close this up. Okay, and that's that bottom binding done. All right, besides a last couple of embellishments that I'm going to make, including the flossing, and I found some really pretty lace that I'm going to sew onto the top, it is done. I measured my waist before I put it on. I am not super tight laced. It's laced. It's designed to have a gap in the back. This should be as parallel as possible. It's not designed necessarily to be super cinched there in the middle. The lacing, which I should have inserted in the video, which took a very long time, is designed so you can get into this yourself. I am at home by myself. I got into this by myself. It looks very nice, honestly, I think. My ribs are right here, but I don't feel like they're being pressed into. I have to say that I feel like this is laced tighter than I would want if I was wearing this all day. But yeah, my waist went down about an inch with it laced this tight. I could have it a little bit looser and I still feel like it was comfortable, and that was only about a ½ an inch. But you can tell where some, you know, everybody's built differently. Some people have squishy bodies that'll squish down. There are people who can get inches down when they're in a corset, and it just squeezes all of the squishy bits down. So my hip measurement alone will increase wearing the corset. The problem I'm going to run into with the dress, I really hope I don't have to make an Edwardian corset just to finally try to tackle the dress more. The Edwardian corsets have a longer line, so the corset goes almost all the way, halfway down the backside practically, which is why you need the hip pads, because that will also slim down the hip measurement. I'm going to see, I think I'm going to have to make another mock-up at least of the skirt part to see if I will absolutely need to make an Edwardian corset to make this work. But it looks really nice. I do not have a modern undergarment on underneath this, so this is it. I feel like I could wear this relatively comfortably doing daily activities. Please excuse my mic cord that the cat is trying to attack. It feels pretty good, honestly. I'm really pleasantly surprised it came out as nice as it did. Not bad. Never thought I'd be showing undergarments on YouTube, for sure. But this is the nature of historical costuming, I guess.